Hello, everyone. Today we are privileged to have Ernst VanBergeijk with us to speak about employment and autism. Dr. VanBergeijk has 30 years' experience in special education and social services. As a social worker, he has conducted special education evaluations, designed individual education programs, crafted behavioral treatment plans, and provided students with counseling, advocacy, and crisis intervention. He has also developed and implemented parent training programs. His current research and practice interests are in the area of transitioning individuals on the autism spectrum to college, independent living, and the world of work. He is a professor at and director of Lesley University's Threshold program, which is the nation's oldest college-based comprehensive transition program for students with a variety of disabilities. It is our extreme pleasure to have Dr. VanBergeijk with us today. So without further ado, take it away.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that warm introduction, Beverly. Once again, my name is Dr. Ernst VanBergeijk, but nobody says VanBergeijk. Everybody calls me Ernst. And I'm going to talk to you today about employment and ASDs and preparing an individual for the world of work. And my comments today are going to come from multiple perspectives. As you've heard, I've been a school social worker. I've run different transition programs in the country. I've worked at the Yale Child Studies Center and the Autism Clinic. And, those are my professional hats. But another perspective I'm going to talk to you from is that of a parent. I'm a parent of 3 young men in their 20s who are at various stages of entering the labor force, one of whom is on the autism spectrum. So what keeps me up at night as a parent is, are my sons going to be able to work, survive, and make a living for themselves when I'm gone? So that's where I'm coming from. And you're going to hear in this presentation some rhetorical questions. I'm not expecting you to answer back, but I'm going to ask some rhetorical questions. But again, at the end of this webinar, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions. And before we begin, I want to do a little exercise, a little visualization exercise, if you would, please. If you would just close your eyes for a second, and I want you to clear your minds, and I want you to visualize a good adult life. What does that look like? You can jot down on paper, what you're visualizing. And when I've done this before with audiences, people typically say things like a good adult life means you have friends, you have families, you have a significant other, a spouse, a partner. I hear people saying you have food, you have shelter, and you have a job. You may join, a spiritual community. So you might be a member of a temple or a church or a mosque. And then when I'm in front of large audiences, I ask them, well, what didn't you visualize? What didn't you write down? What didn't you see in your mind when you think about a good adult life? And without fail, I've been doing this exercise for about 10, 12 years. Not a single person said to me, you have to have a 4-year college degree to have a good adult life. In fact, most Americans don't have a 4-year college degree. Most people in the world don't have a 4-year college degree, and yet they live good, complete adult lives. Now, you might be saying to yourself, well, Ernst, it's a little hypocritical coming from you. A, you work at a college, and B, you got a PhD. Yes, that is true. Maybe I stayed in college so long because I couldn't find my way out, and I needed the structure. But there are plenty of opportunities for work without having a college degree, and plenty of opportunities for people on the autism spectrum to find employment. Now, I'm going to give you some numbers in the beginning, some data. And those numbers and data may be really daunting and maybe even a little depressing. I don't want you to give up hope, because there are some bright spots in the economy, and there are ways that we can help our students with autism spectrum disorders find work. Now, this quote is one that I hear over and over again from parents that I work with. My child with autism was the last hired and the first fired. And that's, troubling. And the data also support that subjective experience. Now, when we take a look at the economy and we take a look at the unemployment rate in the United States, what is that unemployment rate? Does anybody know off the top of their head? If you've been reading the latest in the newspapers, the unemployment rate is actually at 4.2%. Now, 4.2%, that's the lowest it's been since before the economic meltdown we had in 2008. And 5% unemployment rate is considered full employment in this country. So if we only have 5% of the population unemployed, that's considered full employment. Now, what is it for people with disabilities? And specifically, what is it for people with autism? Well, the numbers aren't as good as 4.2. If we take a look at the unemployment rate for people with disabilities in general, according to the U.S. Department of Labor, Bureau of Labor Statistics, that unemployment rate is 10.5%. So it's 2.5 times what it is for people without disabilities. Is that an accurate number? You've got to ask yourself about that. Does it represent really people with disabilities? And what about people with an autism spectrum disorder? Well, we don't know what the employment rate is for people with an autism spectrum disorder. We don't really know for sure. And why don't we know this? Well, a lot of this has to do with definitions, with terms, and with how the government collects and defines terms and collects data. There are no epidemiological data collected on folks with autism. We don't have a list of everybody in the country who has an autism spectrum disorder. And we couldn't do a census of that list. And we couldn't take a random sample from that list to find out what the employment or unemployment rates are for people with an autism spectrum disorder. How the government collects and defines terms really impacts what we know. In terms of how they collect employment and unemployment data, they really do it through two mechanisms. And the one mechanism is the current population survey, and that's by the U.S. Census. And the second is the current employment survey, which is conducted by the U.S. Department of Labor. And how they determine whether or not somebody has a disability is by asking 6 really generic questions. And these generic questions are more heavily weighted to folks with physical kinds of disabilities. They don't ask specific questions about neurologically based disabilities. So that's how come maybe we don't know everything that we could know about the employment or unemployment rates for people with an ASD. So in terms of defining terms, when I'm talking about an employment trend, what I'm referring to is the general direction towards which the labor market is moving. So you'll hear me use that word, employment trends, frequently. In terms of what is employment, according to the U.S. Department of Labor's current employment statistics, employment is an estimate of the number of non-farm payroll jobs in the U.S. economy. So this doesn't include people who are working under the table or off the books. It also doesn't include a whole bunch of other people. And these numbers represent people who are either working full-time or part-time. And they have to have been working as a part of the 12th day of the month, because that's when they collect their data. This term employment and the employment data exclude people who own businesses. It excludes people who are self-employed. And it excludes people who are farm workers or work in the households. And it also doesn't include people who are uniformed members of the armed services. So why are these definitions important? What it does is it helps masks or underreports the issue of employment for people with disabilities in general, but also specifically for people with an ASD. So again, these definitions don't include people who are self-employed, they don't include farm workers, they don't include folks that are involved in the military, but it also doesn't include individuals who are institutionalized or who are in congregate care or perhaps incarcerated. And the biggest group that it doesn't include is those who have given up looking for work. And I know with the students and alumni I work with, that's the biggest population. They get frustrated, they get overwhelmed, and they stop looking for work. I mean, how many people do you think who are disabled are out of the workforce, not looking for work? You might have your numbers. Well, according to the U.S. Department of Labor, Bureau of Labor Statistics, 8 out of 10 people with a disability are not in the labor force. And I would argue that that number is actually greater for people with an autism spectrum disorder. In fact, Stephen Shore talks about, he's an individual who's a researcher, he's a professor, and he's a self-identified individual with a autism spectrum disorder. He has identified that folks with an autism spectrum disorder, only 12% of those individuals are working at their capacity. In other words, working full-time, if that is what their capacity. Many of them are just not in the labor force. They've given up. So what are the autism spectrum disorder specific data? Well, they vary. If you look at Holler's work, in their sample, 25% of individuals with an autism spectrum disorder were employed. Now, if you look in Barnveld's work, their sample of 169 high-functioning individuals on the autism spectrum, 49% of that sample had paid employment. Anecdotally, I hear more like 90% of individuals with an autism spectrum disorder are unemployed if they aren't receiving some sort of intervention to help them with employment. Paul Shawtalk and his group of researchers in 2012, took a look at, some national transition longitudinal study 2 data, and what his team found was that 34.7% of individuals as part of this survey attended that had an ASD, and 55%, which is optimistic, had paid employment within 6 years after high school. But what he and his team also found was that over 50% of young people with an ASD were not employed 2 years after high school. So we have a whole group of young people who are sitting around not engaged in the labor force. Okay. Now, Standifer also took a look at the National Transition Longitudinal Study 2 data. And what his analysis found was that the proportion of young adults with an autism spectrum disorder were employed at the same rate as young adults with really some very significant disabilities. So they were comparable to people that had a combination of deafness and blindness as their disability, or the employment rates of people with ASDs were comparable to young people that had multiple disabilities. And Standifer points out that this suggests that autism as a disability is really very complex and has a major impact upon employment. And Standifer, in looking at this data, found that folks with an autism spectrum disorder who were working, they earned 86% of what other young people with other disabilities earned. So in other words, they earned 14% less in wages than even individuals with other kinds of disabilities. What he also found was that half of the young people with an ASD worked in less than 20 hours a week. And that rate of working less than 20 hours a week was 4 times greater than all the other disabilities studied in this study. In fact, even their average number of hours per week were 36% less. Young people, as a part of this study, on average worked with an ASD worked 23 hours per week versus all other students that had a disability that worked almost 36 hours per week, or actually full-time. And the proportion of individuals with an autism spectrum disorder that were working full-time was 1/3 of that of young people with other kinds of disabilities. In fact, only about 26% of individuals with an ASD in this study worked full-time, whereas 71% of all individuals with disabilities, of different kinds of disabilities, were working full-time. So really a big discrepancy between autism and other kinds of disabilities. So there is one thing we know, and the one thing we do know is that education matters. Participation in any kind of post-secondary education, what I mean by that is like vocational training, getting a college certificate, or even one college course significantly enhances the ability of individuals with disabilities to find meaningful employment. In fact, according to OSER, students with a disability who earn a BA degree obtain employment at almost the same rate as their neurotypical peers. Okay, and that's for all disabilities in general. There is some more specific autism research that would, put that into debate, and that they are still hired at a little bit less than their non-disabled peers. But in terms of education and lifetime earnings, again, education makes a difference. As you can see on the right hand of this chart, if someone drops out at the 8th grade, their synthetic lifetime earnings is only about $900,000. And what the term synthetic work-life earnings means is simply they're assuming that you're going to work from age 25 to 65 nonstop, no interruptions. So imagine, you're living in somewhere like New York City or Boston or LA. Can you really afford to live on $900,000 over your lifetime? Probably not. Not easily. You'll have to have multiple jobs. However, if the individual goes on and gets an associate degree, you've already doubled your lifetime earnings. You're going to make about $1.8 million over your lifetime. And if someone's able and capable of earning, let's say a master's degree, you're going to triple the amount of lifetime earnings that you would have had you dropped out of school at the 8th grade. So what are the choices? What can you do to get training for employment? How can you break into that labor market? Well, there are really 3 generic paths that you can go down. One of them is to, go and go to a vocational program and be in a vocational program. And you've probably heard names of different kinds of vocational programs. You may have heard of things like a sheltered workshop. You may have heard of things like dehabilitation. You may have heard of things like supported employment. And what I mean by supported employment is folks with disabilities go work in a competitive employment business, and they're supported by a job coach. And what I mean by competitive employment is where you're going to work for pay and there are no supports. So, do those kind of programs work? We're going to find that out in a minute. Okay? The second type of path you can go down in terms of getting training and getting into the labor force is supported academic programs. Okay, now supported academic programs at colleges, a person with an ASD has to apply to the college, go in through the front door, and you're going to have to meet the admissions requirements and be otherwise qualified. So you'd probably have to take the ACT or the SAT, write the application, and be admitted to the program of your choosing. And at each and every college, what they'll have is a Disability Student Services office who are going to provide you with reasonable accommodations under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Okay, what shift and the paradigm shift here is when you go off to college, before you go off to college, education was a right. It was an entitlement under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. However, when you get to college, education is considered a privilege, and you must be otherwise qualified to attend. So that means you're going to have to do some of the same work as everybody else, and they're going to make what they call reasonable accommodations. Now, if you look at Kirsten Brown's research from this year, in fact, she surveyed over 1,200 post-secondary institutions, and they were a combination of 4-year colleges and 2-year community colleges. And when they talked about supporting people in their programs, particularly those on the ASD spectrum, over 90% of the institutions really just use academically focused accommodations like extended time on a test, quiet testing locations. Okay, but we know that students on an autism spectrum really need more than that. They need help with the social realm and the independent living realm. In that same survey, only 44% of institutions provided sensory accommodations, and only 28% of the colleges that participated in that survey actually provided autism spectrum disorder specific services. And the strongest predictor of whether or not a college provides those kind of services is whether or not they had the existence of a peer mentoring program. And surprisingly, most students who are on the autism spectrum who are going to go off to college are going to go to a 2-year college. They're going to go to a community college rather than a 4-year college. But according to the U.S. Department of Education, 78% of 4-year public institutions and only 70% of 2-year public institutions actually acknowledge enrolling students with an autism spectrum disorder. Now, our third choice are transition programs that are post-secondary. And you can have community-based transition programs, which are typically run and organized by non-for-profit social service organizations or for-profit social service organizations that are housed in an apartment complex nearby a college. And they'll do all their teaching in that apartment complex, and they have a memoranda of understanding, often with a local community college. The second type of transition program is the college-based transition program, and this is a transition program that is a department of the university. They answer to usually a provost's office, and there's state oversight of the services that they provide. And the latest hybrid of the college-based transition programs is what we call a comprehensive transition and post-secondary program. And this came about with the passage of the Higher Education Opportunity Act in 2008, which for the first time created this notion of what we call a CTP, a comprehensive transition and post-secondary program, and finally allowed individuals with disabilities to gain access to federal student aid. So where and how do you find these kind of programs? Well, the vocational programs, you're going to work in your home state with either state offices of vocational rehabilitative services, and they can be called all different kinds of names depending on the state that you live in. For example, here in the state of Massachusetts, our Vocational Rehabilitation Services Office is called the Massachusetts Rehabilitation Commission. Or you might work with a state office of developmental disability services to find a vocational program. The second pathway are the supported academic programs, and here you're going to work directly with a college and you're going to contact the college disability offices. And for you young people who are in the audience who are thinking of going away to college, this is something that you have to do on your own. You have to self-advocate. Mom and dad cannot approach the college and start advocating for you to get services. It really has to be done by the adult student with the disability. Now, the third pathway, in terms of comprehensive transition and post-secondary programs, there are a number of different resources that you can check out. you'll see this blue URL is to the free application for federal student aid website. And unfortunately, this information is deeply buried in the website, not easy to find, so you're going to probably have to cut and paste this URL into your browser. And what it'll do is get you on what they call the FAFSA website, the free application for federal student aid, at fafsa.ed.gov. And you're going to go to, who's eligible. And you'll see a picture of an individual with classic Down syndrome. And it says that it's for individuals with intellectual disability. But what most people don't realize about the law, it includes not only intellectual disability, but other significant cognitive impairments. So it's a much bigger umbrella than what most people understand it to be. And if you go to that website and that page on the website, what you'll see is not only all the definitions and what you're entitled to if you qualify for federal student aid, but at the very bottom it's going to give you a listing of all the U.S. Department of Education approved comprehensive transition and post-secondary programs. So as of today, there are 69 college programs that are approved by the U.S. Department of Education under this comprehensive transition and post-secondary label. And that's out of over 7,600 institutions of higher education. A second resource for you to find a transition program, either college-based or community-based, is thinkcollege.net. And thinkcollege.net is a clearinghouse of information, and it's going to be not just for autism, but a wide variety of disabilities, and it'll include the college-based and the college-affiliated transition programs. And then you have the Heath Center National Transition Study down at George Washington University. They, too, have a clearinghouse of information on not only transition-age youth, but they have autism-specific data and resources available. So I would go and check those out if you're trying to find one of these kind of programs. So in terms of autism-specific data, what do we know that works? Well, if a student with an autism spectrum disorder received career counseling in high school and the folks in their high school contacted either a post-secondary vocational training program or potential employers, these were significant factors in making sure that student with an ASD was employed. A finding by OL this year was that students or employees who disclosed their diagnosis were 3 times more likely to be employed. Now, again, that's a research finding I would look at with a caveat. That's one research finding. And I think the timing of that disclosure is also very important. You wouldn't want to disclose the ASD in the beginning of an interview, and you wouldn't want to disclose that in a cover letter when you're trying to apply for a job, because there's other research that shows that by disclosing a disability in a cover letter, that person is less likely to even get an interview. The other predictor of employment was higher education levels. So the more education and training an individual got, the more likely they were to be employed. Pillay and Brown did a meta-analysis of 289 studies looking at autism spectrum disorders and predictors of employment. And out of the 289 studies they found, they boiled it down to very stringent inclusion criteria, and only 8 studies met their inclusion criteria. And the traits, or the 4 best predictors of employment for somebody with an autism spectrum disorder, was did they work in a supported workplace? The second predictor of employment was did they receive interventions to deal with some behavioral issues or some autism spectrum disorder traits? The third predictor of employment was did the individual receive interventions on helping them become functionally independent? And the fourth predictor of employment was, was there some family advocacy? And what most people don't realize is that 8 50% of the jobs are not found through want ads, in a newspaper, because that's archaic, but they're not found on Monster.com, but they're found through personal contacts, and families are some of the best personal contacts we can find. Now, Milligor's study looked at data from the federal government from vocational rehabilitative services. And so their team's finding was that the odds for employment were greater if vocational rehabilitative services actually provided job placement services. Well, guess what? Youth with ASDs, only 48% of them got that service. So they're less likely to be employed. And then the best predictor of post-secondary earning was if the individual got some post-secondary college-type services. But only 10% of the vocational rehabilitative services data set actually received those services. So if you're working with vocational rehabilitative services, ask them about post-secondary college services and try to get those services for the person you're working with. So, now I've talked a lot about college level, but what about people with severe disabilities? Well, Carter, Austin, and Traynor found that paid community-based employment while in high school was the strongest correlate of being employed after high school for individuals with an autism spectrum disorder that was quite severe. Other correlates of being employed was being male and having more independence and self-care, and having higher social skills, also another predictor of employment. Having household responsibilities during adolescence also was correlated with higher employment rates, as well as higher parent expectations about future work was correlated more highly with employment. All of these increase the odds of employment after high school. So do these programs work? Vocational training programs, post-secondary college-based programs. I mean, the one thing I forgot to mention was these comprehensive transition programs are really a hybrid of vocational programs along with the supported academic programs. And so different researchers have looked at some of these pathways. And Paul Wayman in 2013 published a really exciting study. And I know that sounds a little geeky coming from somebody who's a professor, but it was really super exciting in the sense that Paul Wayman and his team at Virginia Commonwealth University were the first to do a random clinical trial of vocational training as an intervention for people on the autism spectrum. So what he and his team did is they randomly assigned high school students with an autism spectrum disorder to either vocational training or what they called business as usual, which was working with the high school special ed department and the state office of vocational rehabilitative services. And what his study found was that 87.5% of the vocational group were employed 6 months after the vocational training versus 6.25% of the individuals who were simply doing business as usual, working with the high schools and the State Office of Vocational Rehabilitative Services. Now, those are abstract numbers, but here's what's, it was statistically significant, but here's what's more important. It was clinically significant, because where did Paul train these people? He trained them to work in hospitals, and they were doing meaningful work. So he had these students working in things like surgical prep. He had them working in the pharmacy, and this was real employment with a living wage. And what Paul and his team know is that, healthcare is a huge growth field. Another evaluation of post-secondary programs, that second and third pathway, is from Moore and Schelling. And what they looked at were people who graduated with an ASD, looked at post-secondary programs, and did they go to a post-secondary program? And 9 out of 10 students with an intellectual disability who graduated from a post-secondary program were employed within 2 years of the study. However, when they compared that finding to, again, the National Transition Longitudinal Study 2, only half of the high school grads with an intellectual disability from that sample were employed. So it almost doubled the odds that somebody would be employed if they attended a post-secondary program. Here's the importance of activities of daily living. Diamond found that it wasn't IQ, it wasn't academic ability that was a better predictor of employment and independent living. It was simply the ability to successfully and consistently complete activities of daily living. So when parents of young children ask me, what can I do to get my child ready for the world of work and independent living, I talk to them about making sure that they're doing chores, they're cleaning up their toys, they're picking up their rooms, they're doing their own laundry, they get themselves up in the morning using an alarm clock or an iPhone, they manage their own medication. I talk to them about finding paid employment in the community, and then having experiences at like sleepaway camp or other experiences and opportunities to be away from home. Now, what are the bright spots in our economy? Well, the service sector, 22% of people with disabilities work there. Okay, particularly food service, huge for people with disabilities. They're able to have gainful employment and support themselves. And overall, people in the service sector in production, transportation, and material moving occupations are going to be employed. Government employment is fantastic for folks with disabilities, and they're really employed at the same rate as non-disabled individuals. And they provide excellent benefits. And then there's self-employment. Individuals on the autism spectrum, as well as other folks with disabilities, are more likely to be self-employed. Matter of fact, they're 40% more likely to be self-employed. I've had students take their perseverations or their interests and turn them into business. I had one young man who was fascinated with cars, and he created his own auto detailing business and supports himself today out in Oklahoma. Now, his family all lives here on the East Coast, but he, for some reason, wanted to move to Oklahoma, and he's really self-supporting and self-sufficient. Healthcare. 6 out of the 10 projected growth professions are in healthcare. Now, not everyone's a doctor, not everyone's a nurse. The hospitals have tons of different kinds of jobs that are available to people with disabilities and for people that are on the autism spectrum. This next slide, you'll notice, comes from the U.S. Department of Labor Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it lists the 20 fastest growing occupations between now and 2024. And you'll notice more than half of them are in the healthcare field. And what's important to note is there are some that require no college degree. Some of them only require certificates. If you see something in the healthcare field that says the word aid, that only requires a certificate. If you see something like physical therapist assistant, that requires an associate's degree. Or occupational therapy assistant requires an associate's degree. So this is where the fastest growing occupations are. Another huge field is the green goods and services industry. And I'm not going to read over what the definition is, but you can see it here yourself. Where are the areas people are going to find jobs? This accounts for 2.6 of the total employment in the United States, and we're talking about 3.4 million jobs in 2011. Unfortunately, with the shutdown of the federal government in 2013 and the sequestration, we no longer have up-to-date data on this field, which is still growing. And the thing to keep in mind is that particularly dealing with e-waste is a huge field that each and every community is going to have to deal with. Although electronics only represent 2% of our landfill by volume, they represent 70% of the toxic waste. Once this stuff starts to break down, it leaches into our water table. And Americans throw away something like 80 to 85% of their electronics. And what I've done in the past at other organizations, we've worked with recyclers to help our students work at various levels of the e-waste industry. We've had students who are assessing the biosystems of computers and determining on whether or not that unit should be refurbished or resold. I've had other students who help dismantle this type of equipment, and yet other students are doing the sorting of the precious metals in reference to this industry. So where do you find all these different jobs? A free and valuable resource, well, it's not really free because you pay through your taxes, is through the U.S. Department of Labor, Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it's the Occupational Outlook Handbook. That's got the latest information, and it's a really cool interactive website where you've got the 818 federally named categorizations of jobs, and you can look through all of those. It'll tell you how much education that job requires. It tells you how much on-the-job training it requires. It will tell you also what the job growth is in terms of percentages, and then it'll give you the raw numbers of those growth. And it'll tell you the median income, and the latest is the median income from 2016. And let's say you find a job title that's close to what you're interested in working. You click on that title, and it'll bring you to a web page that will describe other jobs and other job titles that are close to that particular job title or job category you looked at. So please use this as a resource. Now, what are characteristics of effective supported work sites? For employers, this is, a work site that is committed to helping employ individuals with a disability. They might allow job coaches to come in. And when I'm working with employers, I ask them to have internships with special needs students because it is to the employer's advantage to have these internships. They're able to get great employees that they can vet. In fact, my students in my program are the type that are going to stay with you. And if you're an employer out there, I know turnover costs you a lot of money because you have to replace that person, you have to advertise the job opening, you have to retrain the new person, and the new person isn't quite up to speed, and that costs your company money. So making sure that you've got folks with disabilities as a part of your labor force is really a smart business move. Other characteristics of supported work sites is they provide support to stay employed, and they help the individual with an ASD or other disability with problem solving and advocacy. These work sites that are effective also help the individual disclose their disability to an employer. And they provide psychiatric services along with the vocational services, because many of our people on the autism spectrum have comorbid anxiety, they have depression, they have ADHD. So that helping them cope with that is an important thing if you're an employer out there. There might be sensory issues that this person has. So you might need a sensory kind of timeout room for them. Or they might need the ability to take breaks or carve out a part of a job, not doing a full job, but just a portion of a job, and maybe even working part-time. So that's like the bulk of my presentation. I wanted to let you know about the Threshold program in particular. We're having an open house, and it's a college open house like any other college experience, and that's going to be on Monday, November 6th from 3 to 5 p.m. in Alumni Hall. And if you'd like to make a reservation, you can either do it at that email address or give us a call at the program. The Threshold program is one of the nation's oldest and largest continually operating college-based transition programs in the country that combine vocational training with the residential experience of living on a college campus. So our students, sleep in our dorms, eat in our cafeterias, use our recreational facilities side by side with the neurotypical population. And when we speak about the Threshold program, we're really talking about 3 different programs. We have our core program, which is a 2-year certificate program for students ages 18 and up who have a wide variety of different kinds of neurologically based learning disabilities. And really our goal in this program is to help them learn how to work and transition into not only the world of work but independent living. Some students will transition into a degree-bearing program, but that's a far smaller number. So then following the 2-year degree certificate program, we have 2 optional programs for graduates of the core program. One is called the Bridge program. The other is called the Transition program. The Bridge program is for a student who's completed the 2-year core program but may not be quite ready for prime time. In other words, they may not have the confidence to take what they've learned in the core program and apply that out in the real world. So what we do is we help them by having them live in our dormitory and supported by our residence life staff. We augment their internship experience now to 4 days a week instead of the 3 days a week they did the prior year. And on their 5th day of class, we actually customize their curriculum so that they're going to learn things that are relevant to them that they need support and help with. It might be budgeting and banking, it might be cooking, it might be bill paying, whatever they need. Then our third program is what we call the Transition program. And that is for students who have graduated from the core program here at Lesley Threshold, and they are ready for prime time. So what we do after graduation is have them come back to us in June, and we put them through a 1-week boot camp where essentially we have them go through the program on steroids. But more importantly, what we have them do is we have them pair up and meet potential roommates. And those roommates go out. They secure a apartment either here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or in Somerville next door. And starting in September, they live in an apartment. And I send my staff of independent living advisors into the apartments to help them with things like cooking, bill paying, negotiating roommate conflicts. And the goal of that program is to actually have them obtain paid employment by the end of the academic year. All 3 of those programs that I just described are supported by Lesley University's Threshold Alumni Center. And the Alumni Center is unique in the sense that we are the only college in the country that has an alumni center specifically dedicated to individuals with a disability who have gone through a program. And what we know is, the Alumni Center does annual alumni surveys. And in terms of our outcomes, overall, we have a 79% employment rate for our graduates, and they work on average 31 hours per week. 77% of our graduates live independently, but 68% of the graduates live within 1 hour of the Alumni Center. And if you drill down deeper into that data, what we find is of those students who have graduated and live within 1 hour of the Alumni Center, they have a 90% employment rate. So obviously the Threshold program is a fee program, but the Alumni Center currently, thanks to donations and grants, is for free. And so we support them not only with employment, but we support them with recreational activities. We even have international trips where the students go abroad. So I'm going to wrap up my comments, and I think we're going to open it up now to questions.
All right. Thank you so much. We did receive a few questions here in the chat box.
Okay.
So let's see here. In general, what do you see in regard to young adults knowing what they want to do in college age?
Well, folks on the autism spectrum at this age are no different than their neurotypical peers. A lot of us don't know what we want to do at college, and in fact, the average undergraduate changes their major 4 different times. So, part of post-secondary education is really exploring, who you are, what your strengths are, what you're not so good at, and what you like to do and what you don't like to do. So I don't see folks on the autism spectrum really being any different than any other undergraduate.
Okay. And we had a couple questions in this regard, but what do you recommend in terms of disclosing that you're on the spectrum, like when to do it, how to do it?
That's tricky, and that's something you got to feel out, and I know that's hard for folks on the autism spectrum. I would never do it in a cover letter because there is research that shows if you have two resumes that are identical and the only thing that you change about one cover letter over the other is the fact that you disclose a disability, the person with the disability is less likely to get the initial interview. So never do it during a cover letter situation. In terms of an interview, I don't necessarily recommend doing that straight away. If you're working with an employer that has a reputation of being supportive of people with disabilities, then you might do it. I know it's hard for individuals on the spectrum to do interviews, and that's why these post-secondary programs are important because they'll train you on how to interview, they'll videotape you on your interview, give you feedback. So that's really kind of tricky. What Temple Grandin recommends, for folks on the autism spectrum who are doing an interview, she recommends this in her book Developing Talents that she wrote with Kate Duffy, is go with your portfolio of your work and focus in on your work and talking about your portfolio, and that makes the interview process easier. It's I think on a case-by-case basis on whether or not you disclose it during the interview process. Once you become employed, and depending on the size of the organization, I would go down to Human Resources and disclose to the Human Resources officer that you are an individual with a disability and you're on the autism spectrum, and work with that person to find out what kinds of reasonable accommodations you could get. And one of the things I would recommend is that you ask that person in Human Resources to get you a mentor for the job. And what I mean by mentors, I don't mean the technical aspects of the job, because folks on the autism spectrum, can learn the technical aspects of the job, but really just trying to decode the social and political environment in a workplace is hard. So that's, I guess, my answer to that. I hope I answered that question.
Okay. And then can you just remind everyone that's on the call of what's the best resource to look for programs like the one at Lesley University, since we have folks from all over the country tuned in?
Well, again, I would look at things like thinkcollege.net. I would look at the Heath Resource Center and their National Youth Transition Center. I would also look, especially if you're looking for federal student aid, I would look at the free application for federal student aid website and look for what you call a CTP, a Comprehensive Transition and Post-Secondary Program. And use the URL that I put in the slide. Don't try to type in CTP or Comprehensive Transition Program or Intellectual Disability, because it's a really not helpful website and search engine. I think they're trying to keep it a secret and making it difficult. So those would be the sources I would check. And one caveat about the the federal aid for students with intellectual disabilities and CTPs, you must know that the only forms of federal student aid available to a student who's in an approved CTP are the grants. And that means the Pell Grants, the Federal Supplemental Education Opportunity Grants, and the work-study monies. And those are not the bulk of federal student aid. The bulk of federal student aid actually comes in the form of subsidized loans. And since this law was passed in 2008, right during the mortgage meltdown of 2008, the Congress didn't want folks with disabilities taking on college debt and not being able to pay that back. If you look at that See Also page and slide that I have, it'll give you some of the URLs for CTPs, but also refers to different laws and resources. The reason I included these laws is because each one of these has something to do with people with disabilities and finding funding to pay for things like vocational training or pre-employment skills training. So knowing the policies, knowing the laws means you know the rules and you know where the money is, and that's why I included that slide. And then on the reference slide, those are just different references I used in preparing this presentation. And those might give you some ideas of where to look to.
Okay, I think we have time for just one more question. And so someone was asking about if an employer is interested in hiring individuals with autism, what kinds of recommendations do you have in regard to that situation?
Well, I would reach out to different agencies that work with individuals with an autism spectrum disorder. Some of these, are parent groups. Some of them are self-advocacy groups. It depends on what your industry is. I know Thorkild Son, a Specialistern, is really helping employ people with coding and computer skills. And then the Non-Pri Institute in Texas, those guys are doing some really cool work around cluster employment. And they have individuals on the autism spectrum who are doing these things called apps for this thing called an iPhone. And they're selling their apps and making money and I'm buying those apps. So I would also contact your local school districts and talk to their transition coordinators to see if can you start a pipeline of high school students to do an internship maybe first at your business, and then do you have some qualified graduates who could come work for my company? So I would reach out to local school districts as well. And then there are also vocational rehabilitative services offices state by state.
Okay, so we want to be respectful of everyone's time, so we're going to have to wrap it up. I know that we didn't get to everyone's questions, but we really appreciate everyone being on, and we are so grateful for you joining us, Dr. VanBergeijk. You did an amazing job.